Hi, my name is Alexandra Baxter, and today I am going to be discussing dress codes. So I chose to cover this topic because this is just something that I care about. I think that student expression is important, but I do agree with the rights of a school to be able to have a controlled learning environment. I think the problem comes when the dress code is illegally or discriminatorily enforced. This can become a detriment to learning as opposed to being a safeguard against distraction. I think the problem with this is that students terms such as, well, terms that I'll talk about in a second, but terms are subjective and more open to interpretation than I think they are on paper. And reality doesn't always play out like it does in a court case when you write up a deposition. So I'm going to talk about Tinker and Demones. I'm going to talk about Bethel School District and Fraser, and I'm going to talk about Peltier and Charter Day School, which are the first two are cases that laid the foundation for the authority that a school district has over a student's right to free speech. And then this final case is just one example of the courts fighting for equality with regard to the enforcing of dress codes in schools. Finally, or next, I'm going to talk about implications of these cases and how this affects minorities in the way that it's enforced. And I have some graphics and some peer-reviewed articles for you in that regard. So let's jump into Tinker. Tinker was a 1969, 1970s case where students protested the Vietnam War, and they wore these lovely little black armbands with peace signs on them as a silent protest for the Vietnam War. And the school district kind of got wind of that, and they didn't like it, and so they banned the armbands, but John Tinker here still decided to wear it to school, and he was suspended. So the Supreme Court case, they decided 7-2 to uphold the students' freedom of speech within the context of a school as far as a political expression and expressing your political ideologies, as long as it was not disruptive to the school environment or infringed on other students' rights. So this was a landmark case because it did protect students' rights, but with restrictions. So it lays out the restriction of if it's not a distraction to the learning environment. And although that is very important and I support that, distraction can be a subjective term. There are later court cases that specify even more that it has to be a substantial distraction. I think that's Hazelwood, but I could be wrong. However, those terms still are up for some debate as far as what is a substantial distraction. So next, I have Bethel School District versus Fraser. And Matthew Fraser was a student in Washington State that gave a speech to his student body in order to get his friend elected. However, the speech was full of sexual innuendos, and I have a little snippet of the speech here because, I don't know, kids are creative, and he just thought he was so funny. So here's a little snippet of his speech. He was suspended for the speech, even though it contained no explicit language. But he had shown this to some teachers, and they had advised him against doing this. So he fully knew what the consequences could have been, and that was part of the decision to uphold the school's right in his suspension, because he did have an understanding of what the consequences would be. The crazy thing about this case is that he was a senior and had a scholarship to college when this took place. His scholarship was revoked, and as this was being decided in lower cases, his position was actually upheld, and so his scholarship was reinstated. And then he actually went to college and finished college by the time this reached the Supreme Court and the lower court's decision was overturned. So he kind of got the good end of that deal, I guess. But the Supreme Court did rule in a 7-2 decision that schools do have a right to censor lewd, vulgar, or indecent student expression, which again, this is a very important responsibility for the school in order to protect the rights of all students, because school is compulsory and students have to go. So they don't necessarily have a choice as to what they're exposed to. So that is kind of school districts or administrators and teachers' responsibility to look out for the rights of all students. I think the problem with this comes when you look at like lewd, vulgar, and indecent. So like, what are those things? His speech, it's easy to see why that's considered lewd, vulgar, and indecent, because the sexual innuendo is so pronounced. However, those terms are very subjective. What is lewd, vulgar, and indecent to me may not be to someone else, depending on race, religion, culture, sexual orientation. There's so many different things that can make this up, and there's not a universal, socially accepted list of things that constitute lewd, vulgar, and indecent that apply to all areas of the country and all cultures and all school settings. So I think that this case, although important for the protection of students, also played into discrimination further down the line. I am sorry for butchering all of these names, but this case really surprised me because it's 2021. So Peltier versus Charter Day School was a 2021 court case in North Carolina where a mother of a kindergarten student at Charter Day School realized that her daughter would be required to wear a skirt, whereas her son did not have to wear a skirt. The school district said that, no, we're not going to make an exception for this. Girls have to wear skirts and boys have to wear pants. I just think it's crazy that this happened in 2021, where there's already been previous court cases kind of stating that you can't have a distinction between genders. And the court did rule in favor of Miss Peltier. But I think it's just crazy that, like, in 2021, this is still kind of a battle that we're fighting. So moving on to the implications, although courts have historically held that dress codes have to be equal between the sexes, there are, like, schools do still have a huge authority over what students wear at school and over uniform policy and being able to institute what's appropriate and what's not, which I think it's always just going to be a double-edged sword, because you can't make something work for every single person. The problem with this blanket kind of uniform policies or strictly enforced dress code is kind of twofold. That girls, and particularly girls of color and girls with like curvier or more developed bodies are more often targeted for dress code violations. And then kind of the flip side of that is rural and suburban areas are not statistically put under these heavy restrictions from uniforms and dress codes as urban schools are. So there's kind of layers of potential discrimination when we look at the history of student expression and dress codes in the United States. So these are not court cases, but I was doing some digging and I found these resources very interesting. So I looked at particularly 3 different studies. And so one was in North Carolina in an urban district, and one was in an anonymous Midwestern high school. To be fair, this was not a peer review article. But so, I mean, I kind of understand the anonymity in that, but it's still an urban Midwestern high school, and then also in the DC area. So the first one in North Carolina, they looked at 110 North Carolina school districts, and the 110 North Carolina school districts that they looked at were out of, I believe, 125 total districts in the state of North Carolina, but 110 of them had their dress codes posted online. So these are the top 20 words and phrases that came up most frequently. So these are the most frequent terms in all of these school districts. And so if you look down, appropriate dress, okay, clean, cleavage, drugs and alcohol, gang symbols, all of these things, as you look down, are either subjective or mostly geared towards girls and women. There are not a ton of these that are specifically objective or specifically geared towards boys and men. So they actually broke that down even further, and they coded all these things, and they actually double coded them, and they came up with this list where there were 170 uses of health and safety, 314 uses of morality, 143 for professionalism, and then almost double for unacceptable girls' clothing as boys' clothing. So I read that chart specifically just to emphasize the sense that although health and safety may be somewhat objective, morality, professionalism are not. I think we like to think that there's a social acceptability that is kind of staunch and hard, but with the diversity of cultures in America, morality is kind of a gray area, and so is professionalism. I think especially in the changing 21st century, where work values and work acceptability is beginning to change, those things are a lot more fluid than what we like to think. So 314 and 143 mentions of things that are subjective. So that's just one part of that. And then with girls' clothing being deemed twice as unacceptable as boys' clothing, that's a problem because our girls are being pulled out of class for these dress code violations. They're missing more class than boys are. And so you're telling them, or you could be telling them through this, that their education is not as important as their male peers. And so this was the anonymous urban Midwestern high school. The different colors are representative of different races and you have the breakdown of male and female. So I guess what I found interesting about this study was you can see that students are out of dress code. They are being coded, and then the discipline. But as you look, you can see that these proportions of survey responders don't line up to those being coded and those being disciplined. So I find it interesting in this study that the highest level of discipline is Black males, which I would have assumed it would be Black females, but in this case it was not. I also find it interesting that although white females are out of code more frequently than Black females, the proportions do not match up in the case of being disciplined. And so then figure 2 shows the relative risk of being coded and disciplined statistically. So just taking a look at those are not, those don't match up either, with Black males being second highest group most likely to be coded, and then Black females being the highest group most likely to be dress coded, but then Black males being the highest relative risk of being disciplined. So that is, those are those studies. And I'm just going to scroll through this super quickly, but I'll let you take your time and kind of go through it. And I encourage you to do so because the stories in this link and in this study are, in my opinion, very powerful because it's the words and the stories of the girls in DC schools that are having to deal with these dress code issues. So this whole study is called Dress Coded Black Girls' Bodies and Bias in DC Schools by the National Women's Center. An added bonus of this is it's very visually appealing, and it kind of gives you the summary and methodology, but I want to scroll down to some of the testimonials. These are just short quotes of girls that have been dress coded or are in these schools, and the pictures behind are interesting because these are outfits and clothing that they've worn while being dress coded. So there's quite a few. As you can see, it's a pretty extensive study, but it's broken down into categories of like weather defiance and I don't know, different kinds of reasons why, like sex stereotypes and racial stereotypes, why students might be dress coded, talking about the difference between boys and girls, and talking about up here with racial stereotypes being viewed as like unprofessional or I don't know, because of like your headwear and things of that nature, not being allowed to wear makeup because it's seen as hypersexualized, not being sure what the rules are, so ambiguity, which is kind of speaks to my point of the subjectiveness of dress code and all of these terms, lewd and indecent and distraction, that kind of go along with these cases. It does lead to ambiguity for the students, so they may not even know what is expected, or if they know what's expected, it might be unequally enforced among staff or among administration. So what you can get away with one teacher, you may not be able to get away with another teacher. So I suggest that you go through this and read some of these testimonials because I found this particular piece quite moving. So that's all I have for That's all I have for dress code. Thank you for listening and sticking with me through this. I hope that perhaps you found some new information or had a new perspective, perhaps on dress codes. Again, just to reiterate, I do fully support schools' authority in being able to maintain a safe and focused educational environment. However, I think the problem with that is language on paper that seems firm becomes ambiguous or subjective in person, therefore leading to discrimination among students of color and women and girls with different body types, and thus leading to time spent out of class and potentially higher suspension rates and or lower grades. So thank you again for listening to my presentation, and have a great day.